General Hospital will reveal after the devastating blow of the temporary custody order favoring Michael during the first court hearing. Willow found herself spiraling into a reality she could no longer tolerate, a world where she had to fight not only for the presence of her children but also for the preservation of her integrity and the very meaning of motherhood. The quiet anguish she had tried to suppress since the separation now hardened into resolve. She would not surrender Wiley and Amelia to a man who, in her heart, she believed had long since crossed the line between justice and manipulation. What was once a tender partnership had become a battle zone, and Willow knew that if she didn't act swiftly, she risked losing everything. Fueled by desperation and a mother's instinct, Willow filed a formal counter-petition to the court, requesting an urgent review of the custody arrangement. In her motion, she demanded that the court re-examine not only the recent events but also Michael's conduct, associations, and the hidden layers of his private life, most notably, a rumored entanglement with Sasha. Though these whispers had first come to her in fragments, quiet suspicions exchanged between Nina and Maxie, Willow could not ignore their implications. Sasha had been acting oddly, and Michael's increasingly secretive behavior only made matters worse. Determined to uncover the truth, Willow hired a discreet private investigator with a background in both surveillance and family law. Her instructions were clear: follow the money, trace the timelines, identify any contact between Michael and Sasha that could suggest a concealed relationship, and, if possible, find out if Michael was harboring a deeper secret. Weeks passed in quiet tension. The children were kept at Carly's home under Michael's custody, and though she visited them briefly, Willow's time was monitored and often interrupted under the guise of scheduling conflicts. Publicly, Michael appeared composed and calm, playing the role of the responsible single father. Privately, however, Willow sensed cracks forming beneath the surface. Her instincts proved right when the investigator delivered a series of findings that shifted the ground beneath her feet. There were multiple sightings of Michael and Sasha together in secluded locations, hospital records indicating that Sasha had visited an OB/GYN just after Halloween. And a damning witness statement from a bartender who clearly remembered Sasha leaving a private party with Michael that very night. As the date for the new custody hearing approached, whispers of the scandal began to circulate within Port Charles. Those closest to Willow and Michael sensed the rising tension but didn't yet grasp the magnitude of what was about to unfold. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse was filled with quiet anticipation. Legal teams hustled through the hallways, media whispered from a distance, and family members took their seats in silent dread. Michael entered the courtroom flanked by Jason and Carly, his face unreadable, exuding confidence. Though he couldn't ignore the uneasy glances Carly occasionally cast his way. On the other side of the aisle, Willow arrived with Drew and her attorney, calm but steely-eyed. Prepared not just to defend her right as a mother but to challenge the foundation of Michael's claims. The judge, an experienced but visibly weary figure, began the proceedings with a call for new evidence. Michael's team opened with standard arguments: stable income, reliable home, history of parental involvement. But when it came time for Willow's counsel to present their case, the mood shifted. Her attorney stood and calmly announced that they would be submitting supplemental evidence regarding the safety and suitability of Michael as a sole guardian. There was a murmur in the gallery. Willow then handed over a sealed folder, its contents carefully curated: time-stamped security footage, eyewitness testimony, phone records, and a redacted copy of a medical report indicating a pregnancy diagnosis for Sasha dated within weeks of her last public appearance with Michael. What followed was nothing short of electric. As the judge reviewed the documents in silence, Willow's attorney explained that the evidence strongly suggested Sasha was pregnant, and that the biological father was Michael. The courtroom exploded in a wave of gasps and muffled shock. Michael sat frozen, his hands clenched, his posture suddenly defensive. Sasha, though not present at the start of the session, was now being summoned for immediate testimony. Jason leaned in toward Michael, whispering urgently, while Carly stared at her son in disbelief, as if seeing a stranger in his place. The judge called for a brief recess to review the implications, but the damage had already been done. In one powerful move, Willow had reframed the entire narrative. No longer was she the grieving ex-wife fighting from a place of weakness, she had become a mother protecting her children from the fallout of deception, secrecy, and irresponsibility. The spotlight was now on Michael, not as a dutiful father, but as a man who had potentially compromised the stability of his own family for the sake of a reckless liaison. And if the pregnancy proved true, the implications for custody, inheritance, and public perception would be profound. When court resumed, Sasha was escorted into the room. Her face was pale. Her eyes red-rimmed with confusion and fear. Under oath, she was asked whether she had been involved with Michael. Her silence was deafening. After a moment of trembling hesitation, she confirmed that she had been with Michael on the night in question, and yes, she had since learned she was pregnant. As to whether Michael was the father, she nodded, quietly, eyes avoiding his. The courtroom descended into stunned silence. Michael's legal team asked for an immediate adjournment, hoping to regroup, but the judge refused. Instead, he ordered a DNA test to verify paternity and temporarily suspended Michael's sole custody rights pending further investigation. For now, the children were to return to Willow's care under monitored conditions. While Michael was instructed to submit to mandatory psychological evaluation and undergo a full review of his parenting capability in light of the new revelations. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Port Charles had never seen a scandal so personal, so layered in betrayal. Michael, once seen as the pillar of responsible fatherhood, now faced scrutiny from all angles. Carly walked silently beside him, lips pursed, her silence more damning than any words. Jason followed behind, the weight of conflict evident in his furrowed brow. For Willow, this was not a moment of triumph, but of vindication. Her path was far from over, but she had taken back control of her narrative. She had exposed a truth that could no longer be ignored. One that would reshape the lives of everyone involved. And for Sasha, the cost of silence had become too great. She now stood at the center of a storm she never wanted. Her child's future caught between a man she once trusted and a woman who refused to be broken. The next chapter would not be easier. But the battle lines had shifted. And the truth had finally come to light. The courtroom fell into a stillness so profound that even the shifting of paper or the faint hum of air conditioning seemed deafening. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause, suspended in the gravity of Willow's revelation. Michael sat in stunned silence. His confident exterior unraveling by the second as his mind scrambled to process the reality now laid bare before him. Across the aisle, Carly sat paralyzed. Her eyes frozen on her son as though trying to comprehend how he had allowed things to spiral so far beyond her understanding. Jason's brow furrowed deeply, his normally calm and measured demeanor now marked with concern and a tinge of betrayal, as he absorbed the magnitude of the accusation. And Nina, seated a few rows back, stared directly at Michael, her gaze intense and unflinching, like a hunter silently daring its prey to confess. She had suspected the truth. But seeing it explode in a public arena like this sent a jolt through her chest. The judge, visibly taken aback, called for decorum and silence in the court, but the tension in the air only thickened. Without missing a beat, Willow's attorney stood and continued, voice calm but unwavering, pressing forward with a new, even more damning argument. He asserted that Michael had deliberately concealed his relationship with Sasha not out of a sense of protection or privacy, but as a calculated move to maintain a public image of responsibility while privately engaging in behavior that posed a clear risk to the welfare of any children in his custody. He cited Sasha's known struggles with substance abuse, past psychiatric interventions, and public breakdowns, not as a condemnation of Sasha herself, but as a sobering context for what kind of instability Michael had introduced into the lives of his children by associating with her in secrecy. More importantly, he argued, Michael had allowed Sasha to shoulder the full weight of the consequences alone, exposing her to public scrutiny and possible legal consequences. While he distanced himself and continued presenting a facade of righteousness to the court. As murmurs filled the gallery, the judge ordered Sasha Corbin to be summoned for immediate questioning. When she entered the courtroom, all eyes turned. Her steps were hesitant, almost faltering, as if her very legs questioned whether she should be there at all. Sasha's face was pale. Her expression one of sheer confusion and fear. She scanned the room, her gaze landing on Willow, who remained composed, and then on Michael, who could no longer meet her eyes. Sasha clutched her handbag tightly, as though it were her last anchor to reality in the midst of an unraveling storm. When asked to take the witness stand, she moved like a ghost, floating in a daze as she was sworn in. The judge, now solemn and grave, asked her directly whether the claims made by Willow were true, whether she was, in fact, pregnant, and whether Michael was the father. The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Sasha looked down, her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Her hands trembled as she twisted a tissue she had brought with her, eyes brimming with unspoken pain. The room waited. The silence stretched. Finally, with a barely audible voice that cracked with emotion, she whispered, "Yes." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom, as though the walls themselves had inhaled. Yes, she was pregnant. Yes, Michael was the father. The truth, long buried beneath layers of shame and secrecy, had clawed its way into the light in front of the judge, the families, and the media that now crowded the courthouse hallways. Sasha immediately broke down in quiet tears, not from guilt or regret, but from the crushing weight of vulnerability. She had not been prepared for this moment. She had not been told. She had trusted Michael to protect her, and now she stood exposed and alone. Michael closed his eyes as the truth settled around him like a noose. The courtroom no longer saw a dedicated father but a man who had chosen to manipulate the truth, shield himself from consequence, and gamble with the lives of others to win a legal advantage. His strategy had backfired spectacularly. The judge's expression hardened with each passing moment as the implications became clear. Michael had engaged in a deceitful relationship with a woman whose emotional and psychological stability was already under question. And he had failed to disclose this during a legal battle involving the well-being of two innocent children. Willow, though undoubtedly vindicated, did not smile. This was not a victory she had sought with joy, but one earned through necessity. Her focus remained on Amelia and Wiley, and the fact that their futures had been jeopardized by a man who was once their protector. The judge, after a long and deliberate silence, ruled that the current temporary custody order was to be immediately reversed. Full temporary custody of both children was granted to Willow, with Michael allowed only supervised visitation until the matter could be thoroughly re-evaluated. Furthermore, the judge demanded that Michael submit to a full psychological evaluation and provide a paternity test to confirm Sasha's claim. The ruling cited not just Michael's concealment of vital information, but his apparent willingness to exploit a vulnerable woman for strategic gain, thus calling into question his moral compass and his fitness as a primary caregiver. The courtroom erupted in whispers and uneasy shifting. Carly covered her mouth in disbelief, tears forming at the corners of her eyes, not for herself, but for her grandchildren who now stood at the center of a war no child should ever witness. Jason sat motionless. The man who had once stood firmly behind Michael now unsure of his place in this unraveling narrative. And Nina. Nina leaned back in her seat, silent and grim, realizing that her instincts had once again been proven right, but at a cost no one had wanted to pay. The aftermath was swift and brutal. News of the courtroom drama spread through Port Charles like wildfire. Whispers became headlines. Speculation became condemnation. Michael's image as the upright heir of the Corinthos legacy lay in ruins. Sasha, despite having never intended to step into the public eye, became the face of scandal. Her agency, her dignity, had been stolen not by the press, but by a man she had trusted. For Willow, the fight was not over, but for the first time in weeks, she walked away with her head held high, her children by her side, and the truth firmly on her side. She had stood alone against an empire of influence, wealth, and deception, and she had won. But as she looked back at the courtroom one final time, she knew the reckoning had only just begun. Sasha, who had spent months clawing her way back from the depths of addiction, grief, and mental health instability, now found herself once again spiraling into a familiar and terrifying abyss, one paved not by her own missteps, but by betrayal, public humiliation, and relentless scrutiny. The courtroom confession that she was pregnant and that Michael was the father had not only shocked the citizens of Port Charles, but also invited a tidal wave of media attention that descended upon her like vultures to a wounded animal. Headlines called her reckless, manipulative, a liability. Paparazzi waited outside her apartment. Tabloids questioned her credibility, dissected her medical records, and speculated wildly about her intentions. What had begun as a quiet journey of recovery had exploded into a spectacle that she could neither control nor escape. To make matters worse, whispers began to circulate suggesting that Sasha had purposefully hidden her pregnancy to manipulate Michael, gain sympathy, or worse, extort legal advantages should her relationship with him become public knowledge. These insinuations, though baseless, began to take root in the minds of those already skeptical of her past. Despite having fought valiantly to reclaim her life and self-worth after a tragic overdose, the trauma of losing her first child, and her high-profile breakdown, Sasha was once again being dragged through the mud. Authorities took notice of the sudden shift in public perception. Within days of her courtroom appearance, Sasha received a summons to appear for a private deposition at the Port Charles Police Department. The official reasoning was that her concealment of the pregnancy might constitute elements of fraud or, in extreme cases, potential neglect or intent to abandon the child. The mere suggestion of such charges sent Sasha into a psychological freefall. The trauma she had buried deep, the crushing weight of guilt over past mistakes, now resurfaced with devastating intensity. Alone, confused, and emotionally raw, she suffered a panic attack outside the PCPD and collapsed. Emergency services were called, and Sasha was admitted into General Hospital under observation. Doctors diagnosed her with acute anxiety disorder, triggered by public and legal pressure, and placed her on temporary psychiatric hold for her own safety. Visitors were restricted. Nurses spoke in hushed voices. And the public, who had once pitted and cheered for her recovery, now debated online whether she was truly unstable or just another actress playing the victim. Michael, meanwhile, was a man unraveling. His initial attempts to defend himself were weak and riddled with contradiction. In statements to the press and the court, he insisted that he had only concealed the relationship and the pregnancy to shield Sasha from undue stress, knowing her history and fragile mental state. But the damage had been done. His words rang hollow in the courtroom and even hollower to those who once stood firmly in his corner. Carly, once the unwavering lioness who protected her son at all costs, was livid. She cornered Michael outside the courthouse in a confrontation witnessed by several bystanders. The betrayal she felt wasn't just personal, it was maternal. Her son had made life-altering decisions, involving not only Sasha but also two innocent children, without ever confiding in her. His arrogance, his belief that he could control the narrative and the consequences, had shattered the trust between them. She walked away from that confrontation with tears in her eyes, muttering that she no longer recognized the man he had become. Jason, always the steady hand at Michael's side, now found himself in an unfamiliar place, uncertain, conflicted, and quietly disillusioned. He had defended Michael for years, believing in his moral compass and loyalty to family. But Willow's revelations, Sasha's collapse, and Michael's subsequent evasiveness forced Jason to reconsider everything. Was Michael truly acting in the best interest of his children, or was he using everyone around him as pawns in a misguided pursuit of control? On the second day of the hearing, Willow returned to court with renewed composure and resolve. No longer the grieving mother who had begged at Michael's doorstep, she now stood as a determined advocate for her children's well-being. Her lawyer presented a comprehensive case, character witnesses, psychological assessments, and parenting records. She outlined a clear and structured plan for the children's care, complete with educational stability and emotional security. She also addressed the court's growing concern regarding Michael's judgment, emphasizing that his entanglement with Sasha, concealed from the court and his co-parent, was a breach of trust and a danger to the fragile balance of their children's lives. The judge deliberated with gravity, visibly disturbed by the events that had unfolded. After reviewing the findings and listening to both sides, he ruled in Willow's favor, granting her full temporary custody of both Amelia and Wiley. Michael was ordered to participate in court-approved psychological counseling and undergo a full paternity test to formally verify Sasha's claim. Until further review, his visitation rights would be supervised and limited to specific hours in a neutral setting. The ruling sent shockwaves across Port Charles. In households and cafes, hospital wings and corporate boardrooms, everyone had an opinion. Few had ever imagined that Willow, the woman long perceived as soft-spoken, submissive, and self-sacrificing, would rise with such fierce legal precision, wielding truth and resilience like a sword. Her transformation was not just a personal victory, but a statement. She would no longer allow herself or her children to be casualties of someone else's lies. Michael, once a shining example of integrity and fatherhood, now stood exposed, his image fractured, his intentions questioned, and his future uncertain. Worse still, the fallout of his choices had pushed Sasha into an emotional and legal crisis from which she might not recover. He had not only failed to protect her, he had used her vulnerability as a shield, and in doing so, endangered them all. The tragedy was multi-layered. A woman on the cusp of redemption had been pulled back into chaos. A man once admired for his honor had fallen into the trap of ego and secrecy. And a mother who had once cried silently for her children had roared back with unshakable purpose. In the days that followed, the town buzzed with rumor and analysis. Would Sasha recover? Would Michael find redemption? And would Willow, now bearing the full weight of 2 children and a public war, manage to stay strong through the battles yet to come? One thing was certain, this was no longer just a custody case. It was a reckoning. A war of hearts, truths, and consequences. And the unborn child at the center of it all was now both the symbol and the battleground of a storm far from over.